It's like taking forever. Oh, we're live. Okay. We are. We're here. We're here and we're live.
We're live.
We are.
So we've been doing this a year and a few months now, and
I don't
pretty consistently don't know when we're live. So one day we'll be really good at this.
I mean, it's part of the shtick now. I don't think we should be.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. Welcome to Suicide and Stuff. We're excited to have our guest, as usual, always excited. And I want to start out with our rating before we do intros, because sometimes in the introductions, things relevant to the rating come up.
Are you sure? You sure you want to do the rating right now?
I'm sure. I'm ready for the rating.
Okay, fine.
We are rated R for language, terror, and some disturbing images. So if you're under 17, make sure you have an adult or something. Or don't tell an adult that you're watching, however that works. I don't know. I used to think into movies that were rated R. It seemed fine. So do, whatever you have to do for that.
Don't tell an adult you're getting an education.
Yeah. If you're offended by bad language, this is probably not the show for you. I am Jess. I use she and her pronouns, and I love talking about suicide. Obviously, that's why we're here. I'm a mad queer feminist, witch, and healer, and I am the director of director of program development at Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners. We run peer support and crisis lines, a whole bunch of them for the state of Colorado. And I'm located in so-called Denver, which is land stolen from the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute, and Sioux tribes. I've spent most of my career looking at intersectional and justice-based emotional support for marginalized people. And I'm super interested in talking about and thinking about things like epistemology and capitalism and ethics in the context of suicide. We'll see if I make it through an episode without bringing up capitalism, but it's been a minute. Des, do you want to introduce yourself?
Not really, because you know what? I still haven't written it down.
It helps.
I've not written my bio down. I can't. I'm Dese'Rae Stage. I run a project called Live Through This, which is a series of portraits and true stories of suicide attempt survivors across the U.S. I'm an artist, a writer. Now I'm an MSW student because I like to suffer. And I have lived experience of suicide attempts, chronic suicidal thoughts. I'm a suicide loss survivor. I do all kinds of different digital projects. IHurtMyselfToday.com is one that Jess and I have been working on together for too many years, and we haven't gotten very far.
Yeah. It looks different.
It does. I randomly got bored and redesigned it one day. And, we do this. I like to complain about things, and suicide is one of the things I like to complain about, mostly the way people deal with it. So that's why we're here.
Yeah.
Craig.
Yeah, I'm Craig Bryan. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm a professor of psychiatry and behavioral health at The Ohio State University. Just moved here actually a few months ago from Utah before that. And my areas of focus clinically in research is suicide prevention. PTSD is a secondary focus. And I do a lot of things. I do research, I do clinical work, I see patients, I do consultation, I teach. So I kind of dabble in a lot of things. And so I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me to join you guys.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We are really excited to start to talk about some legal issues and stuff tonight. I think that's something that's really important that we kind of dance around some in these episodes quite a bit. So can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to start thinking about or working on suicide prevention?
Yeah, I think there probably was, at least as far back as I can remember, high school, there was an interest in psychology and suicide. I think probably, maybe, I don't know for sure, but maybe some of my earliest interests was really related to like friends that I had in high school who self-injured, who were suicidal. And I think maybe that, kind of sparked my interest to kind of understand what was going on and how can we help people, who are experiencing that kind of pain. And so then once I got to graduate school, years later, My training director was actually David Rudd, who is a fairly well-known researcher, treatment developer. And he, you know, I didn't go to school to be a researcher though. I went and got a PsyD. I wanted to be a clinician. The idea of research was just sort of like kind of mind numbing to me at the time. And while I was in graduate school learning to be a clinician, David really encouraged me to eventually join the military, which was sort of something that nobody would have guessed that I would have done. And so I joined the military, and that was right when suicide rates started going up in the military. And so it became this sort of pressing issue. And then I think for me, I would say a turning point professionally and personally was when I deployed to Iraq and was in a combat hospital. And that was very life transformative for me. And I think on the suicide side of things, what really impacted me was, when people would die by suicide, it was almost always gunshot wound. Everyone's carrying loaded weapons in a combat zone. And so seeing basically dead bodies in a hospital, we were keeping them alive so that we could return them home. And it really had a profound effect on me. And I realized it was an aspect of suicide that I had not confronted, because for many of us as like outpatient therapists, suicide is something that happens somewhere else. And then if someone survives, they come in and we talk about it. And that was the first time where it was like, oh shit, like there's a brutality, especially with firearm suicide, that really, I think, had a pronounced effect on me personally. And so ever since then, that really kind of pushed me into the research field, and I've been doing a lot of research ever since.
So something that you had said that kind of struck me a little bit is you were talking about like being working for a treatment developer, working with a treatment developer. I'm interested in like what you would say sort of defines the goal of developing a treatment related to suicide. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, I would say probably different people would define it in different ways. I think the way that I have conceptualized it in my work is, helping people to live meaningful, high quality lives. And, I certainly know in the research that I've done, we focus on like suicide attempts as an outcome. And, the things that we report in our, treatment studies when we publish papers are, does this treatment have lower rates of suicide attempt than the other? Does this treatment lead to faster reductions in ideation to the other? Those sorts of things. But I think qualitatively, the way that I've really understood the work that we do and why treatments seem to work for people has really been heavily influenced by the feedback that it's the things that people say to us. And we did interviews at the end of our treatment studies where we just talked with people like, what was helpful, what was not helpful, what did you like, what did you hate, what should we change, what should we keep? And it was really striking to me how many people would tell us that the reasons why the treatments worked for them or were helpful was not because we got rid of depression or hopelessness and bad things. It was really helping them to change their perspective of themselves and to realize that maybe I don't have to make decisions like to kill myself when I'm under duress. Maybe there are things in my life that are worth living for, even though I'm also experiencing a lot of pain and suffering. And so I've always just been struck by that. And that's how I've thought about it when I teach students and trainees. I say, I think we get obsessed with stopping people from dying, but really what I think what makes a difference is how do we make life worth living? Because it's easy to actually keep someone biologically alive. It's not as easy to foster a motivation to continue living, especially if they find themselves in, challenging, complex situations where there are lots of reasons to not, maybe want to stay alive. So it's actually something is now that I've moved to Ohio, I think that'll be an increasing focus of my research. I'm really sort of obsessed in many ways, like why do these treatments work? And then the other kind of related question is it doesn't work for everybody, and why not? And what do we need to do? Do we need to change it? Do we need to manipulate it? I don't know what, but I'm hoping, that'll be something I can help to figure out in the next maybe 10, 20 years.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think, we've been around each other in lots of the same kinds of circles for a while. And I think that in general, psychiatric approaches tend to sort of focus internally on like what a person can do to survive whatever situation they're in, right? That's sort of the point of psychiatry. I think it's bigger than that, but like to put it kind of simply. And then I generally take the approach of like when I'm thinking about suicide is that like the world is what should change. And that doesn't mean that while we're waiting for the world to change, we can't also do things that help people sort of survive in between. But I think sometimes those two perspectives can be at odds about like what it means we should do when people are struggling or in moments of crisis. I think they can bring people to two different conclusions. Which I think is why tort law, which is one of the things that we a John Mayer song. What John Mayer song as my strategy for staying alive?
The one about waiting on the world to change.
Oh no, I'm not waiting. But yeah, I think that's part of how some of the ways that the laws function can kind of work against us, this is my very, very good transition into talking about tort law. But I think the laws, in the way that laws are structured, and not just the sort of written letter of the law, but the way that lawsuits and civil lawsuits work for people is really built around some of these ideas about who has responsibility for people's actions when they die by suicide, and what it means to be a suicidal person, and what rights you should have and shouldn't have, sort of based on that. I think all of those things are sort of wrapped up in how those laws have come to exist. So let's dive into that. Yeah. Tell us about what tort law is.
Well, that's kind of a big question. I think probably as it applies to, mental health treatment is the notion of it has a certain level of medical care been delivered, and the term that you hear a lot is standard of care. And I like to think of that notion of standard of care sort of like there's this like bar that in essence you should be exceeding. It's a threshold where if you hit that bar, you hit that line, we would say, well, that is the standard. And so as long as you're past that point, then in essence, we're all good, theoretically. And then where kind of the litigation aspect comes from then is the assumption that, well, perhaps a provider has not met that standard, so they've fallen short of that bar or that threshold. And if so, then there is a possibility that they are liable for a negative adverse outcome when it comes to mental health treatment. Suicide, of course, the most common outcome is suicide death. And so there's an assumption that the healthcare provider failed to provide that minimum threshold of care that was reasonable. And as a result, they're assumed to have been causally related to that individual's death. And so all of, I don't know if it's all, but at least in many ways, sort of the big idea behind tort litigation within the healthcare system is this notion that, basically you fell short as a healthcare provider, and because of that, it's your fault that this bad thing happened to a patient. And so we're going to prove that, and then we are going to charge you with damages, which typically means that there's a financial cost or financial penalty that is paid out to the injured parties, oftentimes the family members who have survived the loss of a loved one.
And I think this is the worst nightmare scenario, I think, for people, especially in private practice, right? Is that I'm going to be individually held responsible in a way that's financially devastating for me. If I don't do like whatever they think that fill in the blank is. but this is so if all of those things were really simple, right? Like if standard of care was a simple concept, if providers knew what the standard of care was, and could agree on that and knew how to provide it, and clients wanted to participate in that, all of this could be a lot simpler. But none of those things are true most of the time, right?
Right. Yeah, it's very, so what I find, and I'll admit, I didn't understand this for a long time. And I think what providers in particular don't understand is the standard of care is actually established by judges and lawyers.
Yeah.
And there is no, it's not a black or white type of thing. It is a very kind of nebulous, it's fuzzy, it's not well defined. There is a lot of subjectivity to it. And the way that the standard is established is, within the context of one of these cases, the person filing the complaint oftentimes will basically hire or enlist the aid of experts who come in and typically say, oh yeah, you fell short of the bar and here's all the reasons why. And then of course the defendants will hire experts, and then that expert will say, no, actually they met the standard and here's all the reasons why. So it becomes this argument. And so my experience doing this as a subject matter expert, as an expert in these cases, is that, there's just a lot of subjectivity. So, it's interesting because within the legal realm, we use terms like, well, here are facts, but how fact is defined within a legal context is not how most of us think about it, like in everyday parlance and language, where we say, well, it's a thing and it's true and I can see it, that's a fact. That's not necessarily the case. And so, in many ways, it's sort of like we basically bring in a bunch of mental health professionals into the legal system and we argue about whether or not a particular provider has done what should have been done. And I guess the other aspect that's kind of weird, it's the whole idea is supposed to be, it's what a typical clinician would do under typical circumstances in this typical context. And so it becomes
which is like might be the wrong thing every time, right? Because we don't train people at suicide at all.
Right. Well, yeah, and that's been, my experience with it. And the reality is you could always find an argument or a perspective where someone has purportedly fallen short of the standard. And the challenge then is really helping to kind of make that case, saying like on some of the cases I've worked with, well, the clinician didn't, here's a good example. This is a case I worked on. The experts were charging the clinician with not having done an adequate suicide risk assessment. And because a suicide risk assessment was not done, they did not know that they needed to hospitalize this patient, and therefore they died, and it's their fault. So then I was hired by the defense, and I reviewed. I'm like, no, actually, there is a suicide risk assessment. Like, here it is. It's like on this page of the medical record, and here's how, like, you can see why they did not hospitalize a person. That was a reasonable decision. And I kid you not, the expert on the other side said, well, but it doesn't say suicide risk assessment on the top of the form. And so it doesn't count as a suicide risk assessment. And I had to work with the lawyers that I was hired by to say, a suicide risk assessment is a clinical activity. It's not a piece of paper. And just because it doesn't have the word suicide risk assessment at the top of the form doesn't mean that that's not what it was. And so those are the types of things that happen that I didn't understand before I started doing legal consulting, where I was like, are you kidding me? And so this is where, as a whole, we learn as a mental health care system, this obsession with documentation, with paperwork, forms, with all this stuff, because these sort of nitty-gritty details that have absolutely nothing to do with a person's healthcare well-being are nonetheless used as evidence of negligence.
Yeah. How many experts are people with lived experience that are brought in to be experts as people with lived experience in these cases that you're familiar with? Have you seen any?
I don't know. If they had lived experience, it certainly wasn't brought up within the case.
Okay, so no one was brought in as like, this person has been suicidal before and they can tell us about why it would be helpful to get this kind of care.
No, and that's typically because within the legal system, there are certain standards, like one is the Daubert standard, which is that decisions are supposed to be made on kind of generally accepted scientific principles. And so it might be the case that like patients for mental health clients, things like that, are interviewed or deposed to gather evidence to make a case for or against something. But in general, that's usually not sort of the primary kind of central piece of the argument that's made.
It's not considered expertise under the law.
Science.
Okay, Coral had a question. Let me go back to it. Coral wanted to know if we know what the prevalence of practitioners who are actually found liable for a suicide death is.
That's a good question. I don't know. My suspicion is that it's probably actually a very small number. And I say that because, if we assume that, well, we don't assume, we know, for instance, like over the past several years, something like 45 to 48,000 U.S. residents have died by suicide. Of those, only I think it's only around 25, 30% are actively engaged in mental health treatment at the time of their death. So you're looking at the small pool, and then of those who were in treatment and died, not all of them have claims brought against them. So I actually think it's probably a pretty small number. I think it's just one of those things because the implications of being found negligent are so enormous that there's a lot of fear and anxiety that's brought up. It kind of relates to another great perspective on this that I've tried to give to clinicians. I said the best way to sort of protect your license is to deliver high quality care.
Right. And then document it, which is unfortunate that matters as much, but start with the high quality care, right?
Yeah. And so one of the kind of mantras that I've gotten in the habit of saying in a lot of depositions is, paperwork doesn't save lives. And it came up spontaneously. I was getting pressed hard by this lawyer because I was arguing, hey, this clinic actually did a reasonable job. No, they did not hospitalize a patient, but that was absolutely an appropriate decision to make. And there's very clear evidence that they actually worked really, really hard as a treatment team to help this person. And sometimes you can do things really well and bad things happen anyway. That's just life. And so they were really reaming me on the paperwork, and I just sort of, as a smart ass remark, just said paperwork doesn't save lives. And then it became this thing that has come up over and over again, and it just, I think it's like this really pithy way of kind of saying this is ridiculous what we're arguing about here.
Yeah. So I think this was all going to lead into having some discussions about forced treatment, because oftentimes what clinicians do to protect themselves is use forced treatment and hospitalizations. Sometimes when a person is already willing to participate in hospitalization, sometimes they're using it without their consent entirely. But I think people sometimes write mental health holds even though a person would willingly go into a hospital. I've heard about that happening quite a lot. So clinicians are sort of using this intervention because they think it protects them somehow. And maybe it does. So I'm wondering if you think that it does protect them somehow, to use an intervention that's maybe not the most helpful for that person.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's hard to say, because I think there is sort of a sense, I could foresee it being helpful, because like I said, where the cases that I've been involved with most, it was usually the sort of the claim against the clinician was that they did not do something that they should have done. And usually it was they should have hospitalized, or they should have discharged from the inpatient unit, or they should not have discharged them. They should have kept the person for longer. And so I do think there is sort of this expectation that, better safe than sorry. I'll just go ahead and do it. And, it's interesting, because I think how we've gotten to this place, aside, from what you guys alluded to before, the lack of training by mental health clinicians, I think another really, I think there's just this fear, and the fear is really related to this unrealistic expectation that we have that that suicide should be entirely preventable. That if someone dies by suicide, someone must have screwed up, and now we need to figure out who it is. And we, at least my experience is, we don't seem to do this in other areas of medicine. It's sort of like, if you're an oncologist, you expect some of your patients are going to die of cancer because they have cancer, or if you're a surgeon, sometimes a patient's going to die on the operating room table, even though you did everything right. And I think we need that same expectation within the mental health disciplines of, sometimes you can provide good, reasonable care, and that good, reasonable care might not be forced treatment. And sometimes the underlying condition, the situation that's pushing a person towards suicide, is stronger than the therapy, than the medication. And it's unfortunate and it's tragic. But that, I think, is just sort of the complexity of life. And sometimes that's received very negatively. I know people feel it's a very brutalistic perspective, but at the same time, I've found, at least when I'm working with some pretty high risk patients, I've had plenty of them who say, well, I could just walk out of here and kill myself. And I'm like, yeah, I know.
Yeah.
And so what are we going to do about it? And I think that sort of valuing of autonomy, I found, works to help keep a person engaged because they feel that it's respectful. I've learned, I've become
that autonomy might be helpful to someone who feels powerless in their life.
Well, it's just having honest discussions with people about the nature of risk. I mean, when people come in and they're really, really despondent, I say, look, this is potentially life-threatening. Here's what I think we should do. I have good reason to believe that it will help. If not, then we'll change it and we'll figure it out, and let's work on this together. And just being sort of honest about the reality of risk, I think, is probably the most important thing that we could do.
So I think that's really helpful for people to hear, is that there are two people involved in this equation, right? Of at least two people involved, certainly the suicidal person, and then whoever is their provider that they're accessing. I'm interested in your thoughts on hospitalization as an intervention in general. Is it something that you think is a really important priority? Do you think it is helpful or harmful, or a little bit of both for different people?
I think it's about sort of like the right time for the right person under the right circumstances. I've certainly worked with many people who've been hospitalized who felt that it was a very valuable experience for them. I've had some who say it absolutely saved my life, but I've also met lots of people for whom it was very toxic and I think harmful. And so those are the types of conversations that I do have with patients. I encourage clinicians to have and say I think we dichotomize it into it's hospitalization, good or bad. It's like, well, it depends, and I think being willing to understand that nuance is, I think, a critical element of this. That is a challenge on the legal side because it's all very black and white in the legal system. It's like they either screwed up or they didn't, and it's hard to do this, and lawyers get frustrated with me because I'm like, well, it depends. Well, is it yes or no? Well, it depends. And that's just the reality that we live in.
I'm interested also in what it is about hospitalization that you think is actually helpful to people. Is it the hospitalization, or is it something else that happens there?
I suspect my sense is that when I've heard people report positive experiences with it, usually it was the things that happened while they were hospitalized. There were good providers. They felt listened to. They, had therapy or, adjustments to medication that, was beneficial to them. And so, or they attended classes where they learned something. And so, yeah, it's very much here again, we're going back to sort of like, it's the thing that you do, it's the quality of the intervention that I think can be very make or break. And where we run into challenges, there's a lot of variability, of course, across hospitals, across providers and what they do. And there's also variability from the patients as well on what's going to work for each individual person. There is going to be some individual differences there. So there is an element of match as well. It's just perhaps sometimes it's just the right person at the right facility works, whereas if that match isn't there, it's not going to be as positive as of an experience.
And I think there's some evidence out there that like involuntarily, like people have a different experience when they're going involuntarily and involuntarily. We also know that just from people's reports, right? But and probably if you've ever worked in a hospital, if that's something that you know about, that people know about in general who have worked in hospitals. I'm interested in, so you do research and you work with people, whether directly or indirectly, you at least train people to work with people who are pretty acutely suicidal. They're having really, really difficult experiences. When you're teaching people about like when they should use an involuntary intervention, what's the threshold for that for you? And I know it's not simple and black and white, but like, I'm just interested in like, how would someone know when this is the point that we should involuntarily treat someone?
So I guess one of the short answers, kind of the cheat that I've used, so to speak, is asking yourself the question, is this person going to be alive tomorrow? And if the answer is no, then the question becomes, well, what do we need to do to change whatever's happening to them, the circumstances of their life, to change that potential outcome? And I very strongly encourage clinicians to recognize, so before you go to involuntary hospitalization, let's realize that there are a lot of options in between outpatient care, which kind of the typical, the stereotype is an hour a week, every week, versus 24/7, lockdown. There are all these things in between. You could increase session frequency. You could do phone contacts in between. You could do regular check-ins where you can increase your availability and the intensity of the care provided to help that individual before we necessarily jump to this next higher level of care. I would say the other time where hospitalization, sometimes I think involuntarily might be in a person's interest, is things like active psychosis, active mania, where a person truly is sort of a threat to their own safety, a threat to others' safety. And it's sort of like we need to kind of at least calm them down so that we can engage them in that collaborative conversation about what is best for you. Because there's sometimes, it's not happened to me very often as a clinician, but there have been a few times with some patients where I'm like, you're just in a mental state right now where I cannot engage with you in the way that I need to maximize and to ensure that we can do this safely on an outpatient basis.
And so I'm sort of just interested from an ethics perspective, how do we, if we're providers, how do we understand where the threshold is between like this person's right to autonomy and sort of our obligation, or perceived obligation, whatever it is, to do an intervention? Like, how do we grapple with those things? Because so this is something I have to think about all the time. I work in a place where there are involuntary interventions that happen, and I'm pretty adamantly opposed to those being even an option on the table. Like if I could rewrite the laws, we wouldn't do it at all ever. And we would find other options. But we do live in a system or work within a system where that's something that's on the table. So I guess where do those two things, I'm sure there's this big gray area, right? And that's why people make all kinds of different decisions. But At what point do the ethics switch from preserving that person's autonomy to protecting them?
I feel like so much of that's going to go back to, are these people trained? You know, do they have any concept of what they're working with? It's almost like, can you get there?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I don't know if I can actually provide a clear answer, but like in my head, what's coming to mind is, I strive to find a way for those two demands to not compete with each other.
Yeah.
And so the way that I have found that this often plays out within the therapy room. You guys both know I do lots of work with like military personnel and veterans. So I work with mostly men. A lot of them have guns. And so this conversation often plays out, you have loaded weapons and you want to kill yourself and you don't want to be hospitalized. I don't want to hospitalize you, but suicidal people having easy access to loaded weapons when you're not sleeping and you're drinking all the time, you agree is not a good situation. And so how do we kind of reconcile these two competing demands? And I want to work with you on that. What I found is that at almost every single time, what we are able to do is say, okay, how do we now restrict access to loaded weapons in a way that you feel like you're not being violated in the process? And so having that conversation saying, you as my patient, help me to come up with a plan so that we can preserve your safety and buy enough time for us to get through this so that the treatment, we can see if it's going to work. Is it going to help? Things like that. And so I sort of feel like, I think that's often a win-win where it's like, I want to respect your autonomy and I want to preserve your dignity and respect. And also I'm having this really hard conversation with you because I really care about you and I don't want you to die. I want to be able to help you with the suffering, with the pain, all these things going on in your life. And if you're willing to trust in me, let's maybe give it a shot.
Yeah. Okay, there were a couple of really good questions that folks had. So I want to go back to, or just statements. I think it's just worth noting that there's this side from if you are on the clinical side of this, or on the treatment providing side, or however you identify that, it's very easy to say things like, oh, we can do all these other things instead, like increase appointments, give you access to outpatient treatment, whatever, whatever list of things those might be. But there are real financial barriers for a lot of people. And actually, we know that financial concerns are a really common issue for suicidal people, and probably just people to have in general. See, I almost got away without talking about capitalism for 40 minutes. But I'm not going to dive too deep into that. But I just think there are also other forces sort of working against us here that are really complicated. So from a clinical perspective, we can say, oh, there's all these options. And there are a million reasons someone might refuse that treatment. And and then they could end up in this higher level of care or a forced hospitalization because the rest of this system is also broken that they can't access other things.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, it's a challenge. I see one of the questions that came in. It's like, well, what if a person can't afford it? And that's a very common issue. And it's a conversation I've had with clinicians. And so clinicians, depending on, who the third party payer is that they're getting reimbursed for their services from, there are some insurance companies that won't reimburse 2 therapy sessions per week, or they won't reimburse those phone calls. And that's where I've talked with clinicians. Like, we each have to make our own personal decision as a clinician about where is that line. And so, if in most cases, most clinicians in private practice don't have such an enormous number of like suicidal individuals that, doing an extra session or extra phone call is going to break the bank. And for someone like me, where it's like 100% of my caseload is suicidal, but I work within a system where I don't have to worry about, payments. I do grant funded work, all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so I think we have to kind of be a little more strategic in how we approach it. I will say, though, kind of a bigger issue that is not something that any of us can solve individually, but I think what it speaks to is, the social factors that contribute to suicide risk. And, a point that I make a lot when I'm interviewed by like journalists and stuff, well, what can we do to improve suicide? I was like, well, increase the minimum wage. That's been shown to reduce suicides. We could improve access to health care, because that's been shown to reduce suicides. And guess what? People don't even have to use the healthcare service. They just have to know they have it as an option, because then they're not worried about breaking the bank anytime they get sick. Oh yeah, by the way, if we ended discrimination, that would also help to reduce suicide.
It's almost like social justice would like benefit people or something.
Yeah,
That's weird.
It's interesting, because I think we have as a whole the suicide prevention community, the way that we view suicide. It's like it's a thing inside of people. We have to root it out with screening and with machine learning methods and things like that. And then once we found the risk, then we have to treat it out of a person, and then they get better. But the reality is that even the treatments that I work on, like brief CBT, that's not going to improve a person's financial security. That's not going to change the fact that your neighbor's an asshole. It's not. Or as a conversation I had with someone last week, a woman who her suicidal thinking was related to being sexually harassed by the men that she worked with. And my reply to her in the email was like, well, the real treatment you need isn't like BCBT. The real treatment is men not being an asshole. But given that's probably not going to happen in the near future for you, let's talk about what are the options. So all that being said is I think we have put all of our eggs into the mental health answer, or the mental health basket. And the reality is that suicide is much, much bigger than that. And treatment is just one piece of the puzzle. And we need to do that really well, but we also need to do these other things really well, because not everyone's going to access treatment, and not everyone needs treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I just think I just want to like make an important note and put a pin in this, that a person who is a professor of psychiatry said that suicide isn't all about mental health. And I would like other people working in suicide prevention to remember this moment.
Fucking for real. Like, why is this hard?
It's not that it's like there's mental health things involved, right? Like our mind is involved in our being in the world, but like there's other stuff involved too.
I think it's, I don't know why, but it's interesting if, I think you guys know Peggy Batten, who's a friend of mine when I was in Utah, and she, published her book a few years ago, The Ethics of Suicide. And yeah, I know, this big thick tome, and that's not even all of it, right? Then there's the online material. So,
yeah,
she brought the manuscript to my house once, and it was like,
yep, yeah.
I'm such a weird fangirl about
so like she and I had all the, because we'd get together for coffee, we'd have like lunch at her house, when we were in Utah, and we would talk about these sorts of things. And one of the things that was really fascinating that I learned from her was, within the historical record, it's probably only been within maybe the last 70, 100 years that suicide has been predominantly conceptualized as a mental health outcome. For centuries, there was theological explanations, there were social explanations, philosophical explanations. But I think what probably happened was we started to apply scientific methods to the understanding of suicide, and it was predominantly psychologists and psychiatrists who were doing that type of work. And so it increasingly moved into the camp, because we started publishing all of these papers, and the science of suicide was really dominated by this particular discipline. And so it has sort of been, I think the lens now is almost entirely from that perspective.
That brings me back to, I didn't revisit Ren's question.
Yes.
And also we're like way late on Beef Corner, and I'm going to do that
God, I
after
know.
I ask this question. Okay, so Rin was asking about how we recognize or reconcile the fact that there's relatively like poor evidence for our ability to predict suicide. But there's this clinical responsibility to do a risk assessment, and that's how we determine the standard of care.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think where that comes from, there's two aspects of the standard of care. The first is foreseeability, and the second is what's called reasonable care. Foreseeability refers to, could you have, reasonably seen that the event, the problem was going to occur? And then if so, if you can reasonably foresee it, then did you do something logical and reasonable to try to prevent that from happening? That's kind of how the two pieces go together. And so where most of the tort litigation came from is that, well, you're not screening, you're not doing a risk assessment. So therefore, there's no way for you to reasonably foresee suicide. So therefore, you didn't do good care. And what clinicians were arguing is like, well, I didn't know it was going to happen. And then in essence, it came back, well, that's because you didn't assess the risk. And so it's your own fault. If you had done it, you would have known it was going to happen, and then you could have prevented it. And what I think what ultimately happened is it was mental health professionals coming in as experts saying, oh, yeah, I mean, look at all this stuff in the record. They should have known it was going to happen. It's so obvious. And so they screwed up, when in reality that, no, it probably was not obvious. I've yet to meet a clinician. I'm sure maybe someone exists somewhere, but I've yet to meet a mental health clinician that said, oh, I absolutely knew that patient was going to kill themselves. And I was just like, all right, cool, go for it. I just
have at it.
Yeah. So I think that's how we kind of got to this. And so now we have this sort of mythology around suicide risk assessment. And, Joe Franklin's meta-analysis from a few years ago, we could basically flip a coin and we'd be just good. And so,
I thought we were really good at it.
Yeah.
We're so hung up on it as a field too, as like how do we predict this risk better? And it's like, does this need to be the focus?
Well, and here's the kicker. One of the points that I've been making is we actually don't even need to be able to predict it to prevent it.
Yeah.
In the same way, the metaphor I like to use is car accidents and traffic fatalities. We have absolutely no way to predict who's going to get into a car accident, who's going to be injured, who's going to die. And we would never even waste time trying to do that. There are too many factors at play to make that reasonable. And so because we cannot predict traffic fatalities, we encourage people to wear their seatbelts, and we have speed limits, and we have airbags, and we have crumple zones in cars, because we just say, hey, let's just accept the risk and let's build an environment where the bad outcome is less likely to happen.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we don't think that same way when it comes to suicide and mental health in general.
Yeah. I feel like that's a very good lead into a very brief beef corner where we all get to say one thing that we have beefs about. because I let us talk too long because I was just excited about the things we were talking about. So my beef for the day is that, this is our beef corner video. We didn't warn you about that. My beef for the day is that first, it's like seems really acceptable to people to just like call things insane and crazy as a way of like delegitimizing them. So there's that as a thing in general. But then within progressive groups, now we've started doing this thing where we just use the term unhinged as if that's like not a reference to the same thing. Like it's not also a fucking slur. And people are using it especially related to politics all the time. People love to use it. And it's just like, don't pretend that you're like an ally to people, or don't pretend that you like give a shit about people with lived experience if you're also going to do that. That's my beef. Des, you got a beef?
I have all the fucking beefs. I don't know. My beef is with grief. Fuck it.
Yeah.
Fuck it.
It's bad.
I hate it and fuck it. Craig?
You got a beef, Craig?
So my beef is bureaucracy, and so this is my environmental source of stress is a different form of paperwork and having to get multiple approvals, and no, you didn't fill out the form the right way, you can't order that pen, those sorts of things. So it just drives me nuts.
Or like, here's your federal mental health grant. You're going to spend 60% of your grant doing the paperwork to be able to do the work that you're supposed to do with this grant. I'm in a little bit of that trap right now. You're familiar. Okay, so we have 9 minutes left.
Are we unbeefed? Is that it?
I think that's a good ending to beef.
That was the fastest,
beef
corner we've ever done.
All of this stuff is a little beefy, right? Like, it's like we're all in this territory of this whole conversation has been in this territory around
beefy.
Beef. Gross. It's so gross every time. We didn't have to do this one. I don't know why it bothers me so much, but it bothers me so much. Okay. We can continue to talk about the stuff we were just talking about, or we can try and have a conversation for 8 minutes now about veterans or guns.
Can we do those things quickly?
Yeah. Where should we start?
I want to ask about red flag laws.
Yeah.
Tell me about your thoughts.
Yes. So I'm sort of ambivalent about it, to be honest. So back when I was still in Utah, it was like a year or two ago, we contemplated, there's like working groups, discussions about possible red flag law in Utah. Never made it to the floor eventually, but I think one of the considerations that some of our legislators had not planned for was there's a lot of pushback from the mental health community, and the reason was this is potentially stigmatizing for people, and are we making assumptions about their decision-making capacity simply because they have a health condition, they have a diagnosis, and then you get into the was the diagnosis made reliably? We know there's a lot of inaccuracies about that. And so that was, I think, really kind of eye-opening. And there's some research, from what I understand, from Mike Anestis, who said, I guess there's some newer research suggesting that in some states, there's some evidence that maybe red flag laws disproportionately affects minority populations as well. And so there might be some inherent bias within the system, which on the one hand, is not at all surprising. And on the other hand, it's like, oh God, how do we keep screwing this up? So it's one of those things where I think it's the idea behind it is well-intentioned, but I think that sometimes how it's implemented maybe is not quite as simple and straightforward as we think, and there could be these unintended consequences from it.
I feel like this is another space that it just has a similar feeling to me as any kind of laws around imminent risk or like duty to warn or whatever. There's lots of names for those kinds of laws in all kinds of places. But it's what I feel like is happening is instead of saying, hey, there's a problem and it's big and it's a problem in society, what we decide to do is focus in on the individual and restrict their rights instead of dealing with the actual problem. So like instead of making it accessible for people to get the things they need when they are suicidal, we're going to use involuntary treatment and involuntary hospitalization as a method of like forcing support on them or keeping them alive or getting whatever we think the outcome is supposed to be, which is them not dying. Same thing with the gun issue. We look at the amount of people that are dying from guns by suicide, and we're like, oh, okay, so all we have to do is take away their guns. And while there is evidence that taking away someone's gun makes them less likely to die, it doesn't mean that that's the way, like, that we should target those people. Like maybe we start looking at things like should people have guns? Or what are the restrictions that there should be on guns in general to increase people's like maybe safety or well-being or whatever?
Yeah.
But instead we like focus on a population of people that we can basically discriminate against and take power away from.
Yeah, it's so I've in the past few years I've done a lot more research on firearm suicide for a number of reasons. At the beginning I kind of shared a personal experience why firearm suicide is something that is personally important to me. But I think the other aspect of it as well is I think firearm suicide decedents are a subgroup of uh, suicide decedents we know almost nothing about because they don't survive the suicide attempt, so we don't get to interview them, we don't get to hear their stories, and it happens very, very quickly. And I think what I have found working more with the gun community is that where we have had the most success is partnering and empowering the gun owners to help each other out. To when my buddy's going through a rough patch or going through a divorce, going over to his house and saying, hey man, I'm going to hold on to your guns for a while because let's just wait until you get through this, in the same way that I take your car keys away from you when you're drunk, and then I'll give it back when everything's okay. The other thing I've learned is that the gun laws that we have in our nation have really made it hard to do that. In some states, it's actually a felony to possess somebody else's firearm.
Yep.
And so this like really logical approach of going to your friend's house or a loved one and saying, man, things are not going well for you right now, I want to babysit your guns for a while, could potentially be seen as a criminal activity, even though it is such a logical, common sense way that we could help each other out and probably very rapidly reduce suicides.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
I
I
had no idea
at any
about that.
time hold on to people's gun. I am not a gun person, but I have frequently had guns in my home, holding on to them for people because I have a lot of suicidal friends. And it's just like, doesn't have to be, there are lots of ways for us to like support people that don't have to look like creating a law where your loved ones go to court and file something that says that you are not competent enough to have this. Like, it's a pretty big deal. It's a public record too. So when your employers look you up, just like involuntary commitments, at least in Colorado, involuntary commitments, not 72-hour holds, but like short-term certifications and long-term certifications, people can see that. And so I think there's, just a lot of really icky stuff. And it's like, we're just trying to control some of the wrong pieces, I think, or we're making laws about the wrong things. And it seems to come from this like desperate need to control suicidal people.
Well, and it's, I think there is this sort of response. I would say when we talk about like firearm suicide and just gun violence in general, I think we immediately jump to legislative solutions. And that I think is, again, it's one piece of the puzzle, but it's not the entirety of things. And it takes me back to the whole traffic fatality thing. Yeah, we have speed limits. We've criminalized drunk driving. We've done things legislatively to reduce risk for traffic fatalities. And we also recognize that there's individual decision-making processes that are involved in how we choose when and how to drive, things like that. And I think that's what we're kind of missing right now. It doesn't only have to be laws, but perhaps in some cases, the legal action is making it easier to intervene and help someone in need. So that it's not this sort of big, potentially legally contentious issue.
Yeah.
Wait, I have a thing. Okay, so Coral says there are survivors of gunshot suicide attempts, and I want to know how many of them you've interviewed, spoken to, what you've learned. And I feel like that ties into that paper that you published recently that says that people who purchase firearms and recently for self-defense are at higher risk for suicide. I feel like they tie in.
Yeah. So I have worked with some firearm suicide attempt survivors. Not many of them, right? It's only about 5 to 10% of those who shoot themselves live, and do not have sufficient. A smaller percentage are able to then talk about it because depending on how they shoot themselves, they're no longer have a capacity to communicate. And so it's very hard to do this type of research. And what we're a big part of the research that I'm doing now is really kind of understanding the dynamics of firearm ownership and how that confers risk for suicide, because we've largely thought about it from an environmental risk standpoint, where if you attempt suicide and you have this highly lethal method, then the probability of fatality is dramatically increased. The work that we're doing is basically geared at, well, maybe there's something about firearm ownership that also kind of pulls a person towards suicide. And the idea behind this, to be honest, what came from a bunch of patients that I treated over the years for PTSD. And there was one who was just 2 years ago. I remember he's sort of the prototype of what really kind of got my thinking into place. Was as we went through the trauma therapy towards the end of the therapy, he spontaneously said, I carry a handgun with me everywhere I go because I just think the world is a dangerous place. And now I'm realizing, as I overcome my trauma, like, why the hell am I carrying a gun everywhere? Like, I live in this rural area. Like, my closest neighbor is 5 miles away. Who the fuck is going to come mug me in the middle of the country? And for him, and I had a few other patients like this as well, once we locked up the gun, they said, I don't think about suicide as much because the gun isn't there. And I used to look at it and think about picking it up and shooting myself. And so those sorts of stories, that feedback from the patients I was working with, I said, I think there's something else going on. And that's what our research now is focused on. Our early findings suggested that those who own firearms to protect themselves, it's the number one reason for acquiring a firearm. They tend to view the world as a more dangerous place. And we're seeing that there are subgroups of those protective firearm owners who perhaps have an increased propensity for, because I think our hypothesis, because they view the world as a dangerous, unsafe place, they perceive threat. And so they misinterpret events as more threatening than perhaps they already are. And we think the way that this plays out with suicide is that sometimes the threat can be internal. Whether it's a thought that you have a feeling, humiliation is another common one that we see. And I'll say one more statistic now, shut up for a while. Another statistic that really I was very powerful for me in my thinking about this is while I was still in Utah. 85% of gun deaths in Utah were suicides. I mean, gun violence in Utah is entirely suicide. And we found that a third of the gun suicides, happened during an argument between typically romantic partners, not necessarily physically violent, but people are charged up, they're angry, they're upset. And then during the course of the argument, one of the partners, almost always the man, says, fuck it, I'm done, grabs a gun, and shoots themselves. And that was just a really profound statistic for me and really started influencing my decision about, like that. I have a hard time saying that was a result of mental illness. It was a result of duress. But was there something about viewing that as a threatening situation, having the gun that maybe prompted a behavior that might not have otherwise occurred if the gun hadn't been there. So we actually will be starting a new study soon, and NIMH has funded us to further understand this. And so I'm hoping that we'll kind of understand what the hell is going on, because I think it has probably really important implications for how we prevent suicide in this group of individuals that we really don't know all that much about.
All right, I want to ask you one final kind of hard question. Maybe it's not hard. It might not be hard at all. I don't know. I'm just curious, like if you got to make rules or laws or whatever we want to call it, would you have like forced treatment as an option for suicide? And if so, what would the criteria for that be, or what would how would you define that as like a
damn hardball here?
Yeah, so I want to say it's an easy question, because I would say no, I wouldn't have forced treatment. I do think that there are probably circumstances where a person might be less willing to engage in treatment that would be in their benefit. And so I am sort of in this place where I say this all the time with like students, when I'm supervising their cases. I'm like, this isn't mental health prison. We don't force patients to do things they don't want to do. It's our responsibility to, perhaps help them to make informed decisions for themselves, all that kind of stuff. But we can't impose our will upon the patient. And where this kind of comes up with balancing this so-called duty to protect the welfare of our patients, I guess what I would say is, why does it have to be forced treatment? And why do we not have enough options available for people that there's something that would be attractive to them? It's not necessarily going to be the case that we'll always find something that will work or will help.
right?
But why do we find ourselves with so many limited options that, in essence, the coercion almost seems like a necessity? And so it's sort of this like kind of philosophical pipe dream, but you did say I get to make the rules. So that would be the world that I would create. It's very similar to an answer I gave many years ago to the question of the VA. Why doesn't the VA do more to prevent veteran suicide? And my response to the reporter was, why is the VA the only institution responsible for protecting the lives of veterans? Why is this not a community commitment when they're our military, they're our veterans? And so I don't understand why a veteran can't just go down the street to the local clinician and expect to receive decent treatment. And I guess that's sort of the worldview that I would have there if I got to make the rules.
Yeah, so I think then I would agree. And I think a lot of people actually in the field agree with this. But so what's interesting to me is like, we aren't doing anything to make that a reality. Like as the suicide prevention field, we might all say we agree to that. And then that's like where it stops. And oftentimes we only say it behind a closed door or maybe in the hallway at a conference, but we're not willing to say it, in a public forum or whatever. But I think it's important that we sort of see part of our obligation as the suicide prevention field to say, okay, we're not going to do this thing anymore because we don't think this thing is the right thing. We have to build these other things. So I guess that's where we can leave things off, because that's a big can of worms I almost opened. But I think that we should be really focusing on how we create those other options instead of pretending like hospitalization is the only one or the one that works.
Right. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you for coming on tonight. This was great. I'm really glad to have someone who was able to talk about some of the legal issues. I think a lot of people feel really scared in that territory to have conversations. So I think that's really beneficial for people to hear about.
Yeah. No, my pleasure. Hope that it was helpful in that sense. And thanks for having me. This was fun. I'll be happy to come back sometime whenever you guys would like to have me back.
Oh yeah, we love having people back on because you get to just expand the discussion so much more. So I'm sure we'll bring you back around.
All right.
Maybe if you're lucky. No, this was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I really appreciate it this time.
Yeah, for real. All right.
We've got Ashley next time.
Yeah, we've got Ashley next time.
Thanks for hanging out with us. We had lots of engagement tonight. It was exciting to me. So
and we didn't get kicked off because we didn't use the blinking GIF.
We didn't get kicked off. All right.
Cannot fucking believe it. All right. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.